13th webinar for the Africa Teachers Webinar Series. This is our 13th session, which will discuss about the innovations in education for refugees and internally displaced persons. Before we dive into the content today, there's some housekeeping items. Interpretation is available in French, Portuguese, and English, so please choose the language you prefer. The recordings and PowerPoints will be shared after this webinar session and will send by email once those materials are ready for you to use. And please, we do have a 30-minute Q&A session for this, and we have very interesting case studies lining up regarding this topic. So feel free to drop any comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and my colleague will facilitate, and you can interact with our speakers. Without further ado, please allow me to invite Mr. Patrick from the EU RTIA facility to give us the opening remarks. Patrick?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Liu. Good afternoon to everyone, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick Kenye, Deputy Team Lead of the Regional Teacher Initiative for Africa, also known as RTIA. It is truly my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, whether you are joining us from across Africa or from other parts of the world. We are delighted to have you with us for what promises to be a rich and inspiring session. Today's webinar is a part of the Africa Teacher Webinar Series, a monthly event launched in February 2025, dedicated to knowledge sharing and the enhancement of education across Africa. Since its inception, the series has brought together educators, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to explore a wide range of topics, including continuous professional development, education for health and well-being, and technologies in education, among others. Each session has been an opportunity to learn, connect, and collectively strengthen education system across our continent. The full collection of past webinars is available via the links that my colleague will share shortly in the chat. Today's session carries a theme that is both timely and deeply meaningful: innovation in education for refugees and internally displaced persons. This topic was chosen first and foremost in recognition of World Refugee Day, observed every year on June 20th. A day dedicated to honoring the resilience and courage of millions of people who have been forced to flee their homes. It also reflects our firm commitment to shining a light on a population that faces specific and significant challenges when it comes to accessing quality education. Globally, refugees and internally displaced persons remain among the most educationally marginalized group. As we collectively strive to achieve inclusive and equitable education for all, we must ensure that no one is left behind. And that means actively seeking and scaling up innovative solutions tailored to their unique needs and circumstances. Our speakers today have each worked on innovative approaches to education for refugees and internally displaced persons. And I warmly thank them for their willingness to share their findings and experiences. I trust that their contribution will spark rich and fruitful exchanges among all of us. This webinar series will not be possible without the generous support of our partners, whom I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and sincerely thank. I here mention the European Union Regional Teacher Initiative for Africa, the Global Partnership for Education Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, a joint endeavor with the International Development Research Center from Canada, the Africa Federation for Teacher Regulatory Authorities, the African Union, UNESCO ICBA, who manages this series. And for this particular session, we are especially grateful for the partnership of the government of Japan. On behalf of Mr. Thomas Poirier, Team Lead of the Regional Teacher Initiative for Africa, and on my own behalf, I wish you all the most enriching and inspiring exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It is upon this combined effort that we have among all the partners to have this platform for knowledge sharing. As we mentioned today, the topic today is about education for refugees and IDPs. And we have Professor Sugimura, the president of the Sophia University from Japan, to give us the keynote address. Professor, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It is a great honor for me to have this great opportunity to deliver today's keynote address. My name is Miki Sugimura. My academic field is comparative and international education, and I currently serve as the president of Sophia University, a Jesuit private university in Tokyo, Japan, while also working as a UNESCO chair. And I'm aware that among today's participants, they are distinguished experts on this very topic, and in that sense, I speak with great humility. Nevertheless, on the occasion of the World Refugee Day on today, June 18, I would like to offer my reflection on the theme Education for Refugees and Internally Displaced Persons. There are 3 key points I hope to share with you today. First, I would like to outline the current situation of those referred to as refugees and internally displaced persons, and to consider whether we are truly able to respond to the challenge expressed in this year's World Refugee Day theme, until everyone is safe. Second, I would like to highlight some of the insights that have emerged from the many discussions held to date regarding refugees and internally displaced persons. Today, I will draw in particular on the 2019 UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, which focusing on the refugees issues. And third, I wish to reflect on the role that education, especially schools, teachers, and educators, can play. In this context, I will introduce the work of Jesuit Worldwide Learning and consider how learning can serve as a pathway toward addressing these pressing issues. First, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, in 2025, a total of 117 million people were forcibly displaced due to conflict, persecution, violence, and human rights violations. Among them, 41 million crossed international borders as refugees, while 68 million remained displaced within their own countries. This means that 1 in every 70 people worldwide, more than 1% of the global population, has been forced to flee their homes. There are also children who are born as refugees. Between 2018 and 2025, an estimated 2.5 million children were born in refugee status, averaging about 300,000 births per year. Children account for as much as 39% of all refugees and others in need of international protection. Let us consider internally displaced persons, those who have been forced to flee their homes due to conflict or persecution, but remain with their own country. At the end of 2025, their number was estimated at 68 million. Because they have not crossed an international border, many are unable to receive formal protection and face extremely harsh conditions. Women and girls account for 53% and children for 42%. Displacement caused by natural disasters is also a major concern. In 2025, there was approximately 30 million disaster-related displacement, and 13 million people remained displaced at the year's end. As a result of these circumstances, the number of stateless persons reached as estimated 4.5 million at the end of 2025, an increasing of 3% from the previous year. Stateless persons are those who are not recognized as nationals by any country, including individuals without proof of nationality or those with ties to multiple states. Because many countries don't report data, the actual number is likely higher. The largest stateless population is the Rohingya, who account for 41%, about 1.8 million people. Meanwhile, in 2025, 14 million people returned to their countries of origin or former places of residence. Resettlement to third countries is an essential protection measure and one of the key solutions for refugees facing urgent risks. In 2025, a total of 81,000 refugees arrived in 24 countries through resettlement on private sponsorship programs. In response to these global realities, UNESCO's 2019 Global Education Monitoring Report, title is Migration, Displacement, and Education, Building Bridges, Not Walls, emphasize the following points. At the global level, the United Nations has worked to bring nations together around durable solutions to migration and displacement challenges. During the UN Summit on Refugees and Migrants in 2016, the report called for investing in conflict prevention, mediation, good governance, the rule of law, and inclusive economic growth. United Nations also drew attention to the need for expanding access to basic services to migrants to tackle inequalities. The report takes that last point further by reminding us that providing education is not only a moral obligation of those in charge of it, but also is a practical solution to many of the ripples caused by moving populations. It must be and should always have been a key part of the response to migration and displacement, an idea whose time has come as a text of the new two global compacts for migrants and refugees show. For those denied the education, marginalization and frustration may be the result. When it taught wrongly, education may distort history and lead to misunderstanding. What I would like to highlight from that I have just shared is the following passage. For those denied education, marginalization and frustration may be the result. When taught wrongly, education may distort history and lead to misunderstanding. Access to education is needless to say of fundamental importance. Ensuring access to school is the first essential step. Yet today, we must go further and ask a deeper question. Is it enough merely to provide access to education, or must we consider more carefully what kind of education is being offered? In this regard, the UNESCO GEM report offers several important insights. The first, the principle of leaving no one behind, the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, places migration and displacement at the center of the global education agenda. The challenges faced by migrant and displaced persons are deeply intertwined with all 17 SDGs, including SDG 4, the education goal on inclusive and equitable quality education. Migration and forced displacement affect not only those who move, but also those who remain and the societies that receive them. Second, migrant and displaced persons are profoundly affected by education, and education in turn shapes societies. Education systems must respond both to those who moved and to those who are left behind. Third, many countries have begun integrating migrants and refugees into their national education systems. Historically, refugees were educated in parallel systems, often of low quality and with limited further prospect. Recent years, however, have seen significant progress. Fourth, despite these advances, major barriers still remain. So the fifth, improving education is essential for enabling migrants and refugees to realize their full potential. Textbooks, teachers, educators, schools, and adult education, and better system for recognizing qualification facilities, access to labor market. Six, so finally, the two recent global compacts on migrants and refugees clearly affirm the central importance of education. To implement these commitments, the UNESCO GEM report presents the 7 key recommendations. First, protect the right to education for migrant and displaced persons. Second, include migrants and displaced persons within national education systems. Third, understand and plan for their specific educational needs. Fourth, address the histories of migration and displacement accurately in education to counter prejudice. Fifth, prepare teachers to respond to diversity and hardship. Sixth, harness and the potential of migrants and displaced persons. And lastly, but not least, 7, support education through both humanitarian and development assistance. What these recommendations collectively suggest is that supporting people's learning requires far more than simply ensuring access to education opportunities. Rather, we must guarantee learning that is responsible to each person's context, aligned with their needs, and genuinely empowering for their future. It is this deeper, context-sensitive approach to education that will enable migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons not only to survive, but to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. Today, there are many meaningful initiatives around the world that embody these principles. Among them, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the work of Jesuit Worldwide Learning, whose efforts offer a compelling example of how education can truly empower those who have been displaced. Jesuit Worldwide Learning, JWL, is a bridge between universities and marginalized communities. They partner with universities and leverage technology to offer accredited programs to learners in crisis-affected regions across the globe. Their motto is that higher education for the excluded and in crisis context is not a dream, it's a reality. JWL began in 2016 with making the dream of higher education a reality for 250 refugees across 3 countries. Since then, JWL has made this dream to a reality for close to 50,000 learners in excluded and crisis-affected communities across 50 countries. JWL provides marginalized youth the world over with access to a range of programs in diverse in-demand fields and levels, certified and accredited by universities from across the globe. Due to this international scope, JWL classified this program in accordance with the International Standard Classification of Education, ISCED, a comprehensive framework for organizing education programs and qualification by levels and fields maintained by the UNESCO. In 2026, JWL celebrates the decade of impact for higher education at the migrant margins, a decade of global collaboration, including universities, local and international organizations, learners themselves, along with innovative use of technology to provide quality education, which supports individuals and their communities in building paths towards peace, social and environmental justice, and human dignity. Taking these above some consideration, I'd like to conclude as follows. When we think about support for refugees and internally displaced persons from the perspective of learning, it goes without saying that access to learning opportunities is essential. At the same time, however, it is equally important to consider what and how they learn. In other words, learning must be responsible to their needs, and such learning shouldn't be a one-way process. Rather, it should be a co-creative endeavor in which learners and those who support them work together to shape the learning experience. This point can be reframed in terms of the concept of equality and equity. That is, while equality refers to equal access and equal opportunities, equity concerns what learning actually means and extends to achieving equality in outcomes. The distinction lies in moving beyond merely providing access to ensuring that learning leads to fair and meaningful results. As I mentioned earlier, the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring GEM report also includes the following statement. When taught wrongly, education may distort history and lead to misunderstanding. But now I'd like to emphasize education is indeed a double-edged sword, and this is precisely why it becomes critically important to consider what is genuinely meaningful for learners and whether it truly empowers refugees and internally displaced persons. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and thank you very much giving for such a precious opportunity to share my thought. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
you.
much, Professor. That was a very informative speech from you with a lot of concrete numbers and recommendations from international organizations and from a global perspective. And I believe that we all agree education is not merely access, but also quality. And today, I'm very happy that we do have concrete, innovative approaches for education for refugees. So I can't wait to show those as well. Now,
thank you
please,
very much.
great, thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming Miss Maria Lucia Urup to give us a little more context about the situation about education for refugees in Africa. Please take the floor, Miss Maria.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous, toutes, bonne tarde. Distinguished colleagues, partners, educators, and friends, it is a privilege to join you today as we commemorate World Refugee Day and reflect on one of the defining educational challenges of our time, ensuring that refugee and internally displaced children have access not only to education, but to learning environments where they can heal, belong, flourish, and contribute to their communities. I would like to thank UNESCO ICBA, the African Union, AFTRA, the European Union Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa, GPE, KIX, the government of Japan, and all partners for creating this important platform for dialogue and learning. Today, I would like to share some reflections on the educational implications of displacement, the importance of safe and empowering learning environments, and how transformative approaches to teaching and learning can support refugee and internally displaced children, not only to learn, but also to flourish. So let us start with a little bit of the context, and Professor Sugimura also spoke about some of these numbers. I'm going to zoom into Africa. Africa is currently experiencing unprecedented levels of forced displacement. Nearly 45 million people have been displaced across the continent. Refugee numbers have increased dramatically over the past 15 years, while the number of internally displaced people has risen to over 29 million. And this situation is primarily driven by escalating armed conflicts, which is the dominant driver of displacement in Africa. Protracted civil wars, ethnic violence, and militant insurgencies. The second driver of factor is climate and environmental disasters. Climate shocks frequently destroy livelihoods and displace communities or compound existing conflict zones by forcing people to flee areas where resources are already scarce. The third is political instability and repression. Unconstitutional changes in power, military coups, and autocratic regimes in countries have severely limited civic rights, triggering mass exodus. And fourth, the protracted crisis and aid shortfalls. Many displacement situations have lasted for years, or even decades. Additionally, many of these crises are chronically underfunded, leaving host communities overwhelmed and millions of displaced people trapped in cyclical poverty. Africa's displacement response faces a severe 50 to 60% funding gap, leaving millions of people without critical aid. Since 2000, and it's important if we go and zoom into children, it's important to say that 1 in every 2 refugees in Africa is a child, totaling more than 4.9 million, and over 16 million are internally displaced due to conflict and violence. Since 2010, the number of refugees has more than tripled, from 2.9 million to 10.6 million in Africa, while the number of internally displaced persons has risen from 9.8 to over 29 million. The largest numbers of African refugee children come from 4 particular countries: South Sudan, followed by Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Somalia. African countries bear much of the responsibility for hosting the continent's refugees, with an estimated 91% of them finding asylum in other African countries. Uganda, for instance, currently hosts the largest number of refugees in Africa, and we must say that it has been recognized for its progressive refugee policy, which, among other aspects, includes the provision of access to education and protection mechanisms for children. Behind these numbers are children whose life have been profoundly disrupted. Children have lost their homes, children separated from family members, friends, teachers, and communities, children whose sense of safety, belonging, and identity has been shaken. Displacement is rarely a temporary experience. Increasingly, it is a long-term reality that shapes childhood and influences development, learning, and future opportunities. And this is why education for refugees and internally displaced children is not simply a humanitarian concern. It is a matter of human rights, social cohesion, sustainable development, and peace. So let us look into the impact of displacement on children. Displacement affects every dimension of a child's life. Children often experience multiple layers of adversity, including exposure to violence, loss, grief, discrimination, uncertainty, and interrupted education. During displacement, their routines are disrupted, their social connections are weakened, their language, their culture, their identity may be challenged. Girls frequently face increased risk of exclusion, early marriage, exploitation, and gender-based violence. Children with disabilities and children from minority groups often encounter additional barriers to accessing quality education. Beyond these visible challenges, displacement also affects children's emotional well-being, relationships, identity formation, and their sense of purpose and meaning. Many children struggle with questions such as, who am I now? Where do I belong? Can I trust others? What does the future hold for me? The consequences are therefore not only educational, they are developmental. Displacement influences children's cognitive, social, emotional, ethical, and spiritual development, often at some of the most formative stages of their lives. So how a crisis and trauma affect learning? Research consistently demonstrates that exposure to conflict, violence, and prolonged stress affects children's ability to learn. Children who have experienced displacement may struggle to focus, participate, manage emotions, or build trust in relationships. Traumatic experiences can lead to anxiety, sadness, fear, difficulties concentrating, memory challenges, and a reduced ability to process information and decision-making. When children are worried about their safety or carrying the burden of difficult experiences, learning becomes significantly harder. As educators, we must recognize that many children arrive in classrooms carrying invisible burdens. This reality challenges us to move beyond providing access and focusing on traditional models of education that focus exclusively on academic content. When children do not feel safe, learning becomes significantly more difficult. And this is why academic recovery should be accompanied by psychosocial recovery. Evidence increasingly confirms this. Social and emotional learning and psychosocial support are not competing priorities with foundational learning. They are enabling conditions for learning. Holistic approaches help children manage stress, strengthen resilience, improve psychosocial and well-being, support better academic outcomes, particularly among refugees and displaced learners. So let's look at the role of education. In emergency contexts, education is often viewed as a service that comes after basic needs have been met. Education is not only a right. In situations of displacement, education is also a protective intervention, and it is life-saving. For children affected by displacement, access to education reduces the risk of trafficking, recruitment in armed groups, child labor, exploitation, early marriage, and adolescent pregnancy. It also provides stability, routines, supportive relationships, and opportunities that help children recover from trauma and regain hope. Beyond this immediate protective role, education is one of the strongest investments that we can make in peace, in social cohesion, economic development, and long-term stability for a country. And yet, despite this transformative role that education plays, it remains one of the most neglected sectors in humanitarian response, receiving only around 3% of global humanitarian funding. Schools often become the most stable and predictable environments in children's lives. They provide structure, relationships, routine, belonging, and hope. But what makes schools truly protected is not simply their existence, it's their ability to create safe and empowering learning environments. As you see in this graphic to the right side, hand side, it reminds us that no single intervention is enough. Children's well-being should be at the center, accompanied by safe and supportive schools, caring and trained teachers, families and caregivers, positive peer relationships, psychosocial support, and strong community and cultural connections. All these reinforce one another. In many contexts, faith communities and religious leaders are also part of these support networks, providing trusted relationships, social support, meaning, and hope. When these protected factors work together, children are more likely to feel safe, valued, and empowered, not only to learn, but also to heal and build a better future. So how does a safe and empowering learning environment look like? It's much more than a physical space. It's an environment where children experience safety, inclusion, respect, participation, and belonging. It's a place where diversity is valued and where every child feels seen, heard, and respected, where children need opportunities to express their thoughts, share experiences, they can ask questions, they can contribute to solutions. It's an stimulating environment where play is there, children can interact, and they can feel emotionally safe and connected. For refugee and displaced children, safe learning environments are particularly important because it helps restoring a sense of normalcy and connection. The ecological model that you see on the right-hand side of the slide places the child at the center and reminds us that development is multidimensional. Children develop cognitively, physically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually. The spiritual dimension is often overlooked in discussions about education in emergencies. Yet, displacement frequently raises profound questions for children about identity, belonging, meaning, hope, and purpose. So I'm not talking about teaching religion. I'm talking about this inner force that children have. It means nurturing children's capacity for meaning-making, hope, connectedness, compassion, ethical reflection, and inner strength. Let us look at the role of teachers. No safe learning environment can exist without teachers. Teachers are among the most important protective factors in children's lives. In displacement settings, children often become mentors, trusted adults, role models, and sources of stability. They help restore predictability and routine. Yet, many teachers are themselves affected by conflict, displacement, and stress. They're expected to respond to increasingly complex needs while working with limited resources and support. If we want to improve educational outcomes for refugees and internally displaced children, we must invest in teachers. So how a framework for safe and empowered learning environments can look like? Based on our experience working with educators in more than 30 countries, several interconnected dimensions are essential. At its center is children's well-being. Surrounding this area are four interconnected dimensions. The first is child rights and human dignity. Every child, regardless of status, nationality, ethnicity, or religion, possesses inherent dignity and equal rights. The second is relationship and ethics. Children learn through relationships, and that's why it's so important when children are displaced. They need opportunities to develop empathy, respect, responsibility, and peaceful ways of relating to others. The third one is hope and a sense of purpose. Children need reasons to believe in the future and confidence that their lives have meaning and value. And the fourth is children's agency and social transformation. Even in situations of displacement, children are not passive recipients of assistance. They are capable contributors, problem solvers, and agents of positive change. These dimensions are supported through safe learning environments, transformative pedagogies, and systemic approaches that engages the broader ecosystem around the child. So to finalize, what outcomes can we expect when these safe learning environments are created? The outcomes shown on this slide are particularly important because they go beyond academic achievement. When children learn in safe and empowering environments, they develop stronger self-esteem. Children become resilient. They develop stronger social and emotional competences. They build confidence and self-esteem. They improve their ability to manage emotions and resolve conflicts. They demonstrate greater empathy and respect for diversity. They develop stronger ethical awareness and greater sense of responsibility toward others. Most importantly, they regain hope. These outcomes are not secondary. They are foundational. Teachers also report improved classroom relationships, greater learner engagement, and more positive school climates. Children who feel valued, connected, and hopeful are better able to engage in learning, build healthy relationships, and contribute positively to their communities. These outcomes are also essential for social cohesion and peace building in societies affected by displacement and conflict. As we mark today the World Refugee Day, let us remember that refugee and internally displaced children are far more than beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance. They are learners, they are leaders, they are contributors, they are holders of rights, dignity, and enormous potential. Our responsibility is not only to ensure access to education, is to create educational environments where children can learn, heal, belong, and flourish. This requires investing in teachers, strengthening foundational learning, supporting mental health and psychosocial support, promoting inclusion, and recognizing the importance of ethical and spiritual development as part of children's holistic well-being. If we are serious about leaving no one behind and no child behind, we must embrace a vision of education that nurtures the whole child and equips children not only to recover from adversity, but to help build more peaceful, inclusive, and resilient societies. Thank you very much, and I look forward to learning from the inspiring experiences and innovations that will be shared by the panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was a very inspiring presentation. It is indeed, education is not only about the access, but more importantly, creating a safe environment for children to learn. And to achieve that, there are so many other aspects we need to consider. Yes, Professor Sugimura, you raised your hand.
No, I just approached. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry. Very wonderful.
No problem at all. Yes, it was a wonderful
Thank you very
presentation.
much. Thank you. So sorry.
No worries. Yes, after this very comprehensive presentation from Ms. Maria, let's go into the case studies. The first one, well, let's welcome Dr. Stadena and Dr. Naomi to talk about the Tusumi, if I pronounce correctly, project in East Africa in terms of strengthening girls' participation in refugees. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So if we can move on to the slide, I will show you quickly what we're going to talk about. So I'm Sladana Kristic from ACI UK, and I will be talking to you about our research that we are doing and what methodology we have been using together with some initial findings. And I will then pass you on to Dr. Naomi, who will talk to you about later findings and, more important, how we went about model adaptation and the next steps. So on the next slide, you will just see all the partners involved in this project. We are very grateful to GP, KIPS, and IDRC for all their support with this project. We are a consortium of 3. We are led by FAWE, the Forum of African Women Educationalists. Tuseme model is their model, and it's already existing in over 20 countries in Africa. HERCA, the Higher Education Resource Services in East Africa, where Dr. Naomi is from, is very much our in-country implementation partner of research. So they do all the data collection, analysis, reporting, and they also produce the knowledge products. And ACI, Australian Council for Educational Research, based in the UK, confusingly enough, is where I'm from. And we are the ones that have developed the research framework, and we do the quality assurance as well as continuous monitoring, evaluation, and learning of the project. So moving on to the next slide, you've already heard so much about this very sobering context of the world we live in, so I will not necessarily go through all of these facts, but just to say that some of these factors for children we work with could be compounded because they could be refugee, but they could also be a girl in a place where gender norms are such that girls are not necessarily always have open access to education, or they might be in a host country that doesn't have enough resources to provide the normal experience of schooling that they might have had. So there's a lot of compounding factors so that the social cohesion, education, and any opportunities for economic independence are severely disrupted. And that's why the quality education matters. As we all know, it offers a lifeline for trying to break out of that cycle of disadvantage and also improve life chances, particularly for this displaced community who have lost their livelihoods. So if we move on to the next slide, I will just tell you a little bit about what our model is all about. So tuseme means let us speak out in Swahili. It's been set up as a model in 1996 in Tanzania, but as I mentioned, it's since been expanded to many other countries, and it's impacting over 80,000 students in Africa. What it aims to do is empower not just girls, but boys as well, to build their self-esteem, leadership skills, social skills, life skills, in order to address gender-based challenges and promote gender equality and equity. And the way it does that is through the creative arts, through the theater drama, where it's student run, so they get together, they identify the issue, they talk about root causes, effects, solutions, and then they put on a performance together with people in their community, which then leads to an action plan on how whatever solution they are coming up with, the action plan is developed on how it can be implemented. So moving on to our next slide. This is what we have aimed to do. So you will see here the very overarching research question that we wanted to do is whether we can take this existing model, learn from it, adapt it, and then have it used in communities where there's a lot of internally displaced and refugee children so that they benefit from the club as well. So it's a 3-year project. We are now in our 3rd year, so we've done quite a lot of work on it. And you have here the sub-question. So there was a lot of trying to learn from the model, trying to adapt the model. But again, in interest of time, I'm not going to read all the questions. But if we move on to the next slide, you can see what our methodology looks like. So there's been a lot going into this. So the phase 1 is when we have started with the existing model, such as it is in these 20 plus countries, and to try to learn as much from it as we can. So what are the enabling factors? What makes it work? What are disabling factors? What creates a barrier? Would it work in different settings? Are there any cross-country differences? Everything we can in this phase 1 is what we've tried to do. Then phase 2 focused very much on scoping, trying to find the communities that particularly host internally displaced persons or refugees, and try to learn from them so that we can know what do we need to adapt to suit this community in particular. And initially, at the moment, we are focused on 3 countries, which is Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And we live in hope that we will be able to have resources to continue that work in many other countries as well. The phase 3 is to adapt the model, and Dr. Naomi will talk to you a little bit about. We take the learnings from phase 1, we take the understanding of the context of phase 2, and we adapt the original model specifically for this very important but marginalized population. Phase 4 is where we are at the moment. It's the deployment. So we have this model, adapted model. It's currently being used in our countries, in these 3 countries, in several schools and centers. And our next phase that comes later this year is to collect data and evaluate it and see, which will obviously learn to phase 4, what can we learn and how can we... Sorry, there's some interference. I don't know if someone wants to say something or is people just not muted. I'll continue unless I see the hand raised, to try to learn in phase 6 and disseminate these findings as much as we can, because we think there's a lot to learn and there's a lot of benefits that can be then scaled up in, as I say, either more places such as schools and refugee centers, or indeed more countries itself. So if we move on to the next slide, as I say, the phase, and then one after that, please. Phase one findings, so which took us a while. So we went to mainstream schools in these three countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda, and we tried to learn from them because they have been using this model for a while. And we have very much learned a lot from there. So what we have learned is that there's a very large and engaged student base, particularly with girls, and combined with teacher-led recruitment and participation in other complementary clubs, there's a really strong momentum for advocacy that TUSEME is championing, so that the stable and trained staff can provide that continuity and institutional knowledge through the years as they change, and that all the existing structures and parental supports help make it a really solid framework. So overall, TUSEME as a club is really well positioned as an effective model for promoting gender equality, as long as you have a supportive and enabling school environment. So those were our enabling factors. But if we move on, of course, like anything else, there are certain barriers in place, certain disabling factors that we wanted to learn about so that we can deal with them in our adapted model. And these include limited awareness about new staff. Staff turnover is in many countries very high, and when you get new teachers, they are not necessarily always familiar and up to date on what TUSEME Club has been achieving so far. Sometimes there's a confusion with similar other programs, which can weaken their support because they think, well, we already do that, but of course they don't. It's a different thing. Student participation is sometimes hindered by either academic pressures if they are trying to keep up with the academia side of the things, or if the environment, and Maria has talked about how important enabling environment is, especially school environment. So the social and cultural norms are a big theme. So things like gender stereotyping or indeed stigma about sensitive topics like menstruation pose ongoing challenge, and it's certainly something we are focusing on and trying to change in our adapted model. I think if we move on, we are now going to phase two learnings first. So this is a summary of what we have learned. So these are the things what we have learned from existing TUSEME clubs in mainstream settings. And as you can see, there's a lot there. We know the importance of engaging parents. We understand how important teachers are and teachers' knowledge in particular. So coming up with strategies to keep that knowledge even if the teachers change, because there is a turnover. So that handover strategy is very important. Even some logistics, such as when do you schedule the club or where, can impact the participation of students, because if it's not convenient, they are less likely to go. So these are simple things, but something that really can improve the participation and benefits to them if it's thought about. And again, just thinking of all the graduating students, because they can act as mentors and role models so that the younger students can shadow and learn, so that when the older students leave, you still have someone who can step up into the role of TUSEME club leader and take it over from them, so there is no gap and loss of knowledge. So these were the learnings from our first phase, which we learned. Then we did the phase two, which was about trying to understand the context of schools and centers for internally displaced children and refugees. And I'll pass you on to my colleague, Dr. Naomi, who will talk to you about phase two findings and how we then used the findings from both phases to adapt our model. So over to you, Dr. Naomi.
Thank you, Sladana. If we just go back to slide 7, please, that says research design. I want to jump from there and then come back to number 2. Go for research design. Yes, thank you. So I wanted to mention that the process is not smooth. In particular, I wanted to pick out, Sladana did mention the phase 6 dissemination, and I wanted to point out to you that our dissemination began a long time ago. So we already have peer-reviewed publications. Once we completed our understanding of TUSEME as a model, we already have a peer-reviewed publication on that. And we'll give you a slide with QR codes So you can actually go straight and find these because we haven't got enough time here to go through them. So if we could now please zoom forward to phase 2 findings. Thank you. So it is interesting listening to prior presenters that most of what they said is actually what we found, and we find that quite validating. So when we try to understand the refugee and IDP setting space so that we can figure out how to adopt the same model that we had learned about in mainstream schools, we found that there were a lot of domestic labor burdens, the economic insecurity stemming from the fact that these people do not know how to adapt to the new environment. They have to learn from scratch in terms of how do you earn a living. And anyway, they don't have anything. So then the emotional trauma and psychological distress was a really significant barrier to our adaptation, even as it comes forward, because the teachers themselves, like my colleague said, are also just as traumatized, but they don't even have the training to handle the traumatized learners. The high rate of student and teacher turnover doesn't surprise you because in some cases, those you teach today may not be there tomorrow. Linguistic barriers. There was one refugee settlement that had about 33 different languages. A lot of them are unwritten languages. So you can imagine what it's like trying to teach in that kind of environment or trying to learn. Then there was hardly enough infrastructure, all the basics, including toilets, water, all those are inadequate in terms of supply. So on the next slide, we grouped the findings by country. And what we've got here are the few that were not repetitive from each country. So most of them were very similar. But some stand out in some countries a little bit more than others. So in Ethiopia, what stood out, the socioeconomic hardship, the resource deficiencies, the cultural beliefs, and then access and quality in terms of education. Kenya, you will find a lot of these are similar, but they differed a little bit because the contexts are not identical, although they have that common denominator of having mobile communities. So in Kenya, again, significant economic hardship, the cultural barriers were a really big issue, including FGM, early marriage, and this is where the theatrical productions are very, very important because it's where the learners, if you like, that gives them a safe framework to present their issues. And then serious shortfall in school infrastructure and teacher support. In Uganda, where, as you heard from my colleague earlier, hosts the largest refugee population, there is widespread poverty in spite of the host families and host communities trying to support the refugees. Then the gender biases, and again, early marriages, domestic chores, psychosocial trauma. In one of the refugee camps in northwestern Uganda, there is a regular inflow almost on a day-to-day basis from Democratic Republic of Congo and from South Sudan. So these were presenting a real challenge for us, but armed with this information, we then went back to the Tuseme manual to try and adapt it using this knowledge. So let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of adaptation, we looked at the model as it is, and then we thought we need to break it down into parts. So one part is about teacher training. What skills did we find the teachers really, really short of that they must have in order to institute this kind of model? Then the flexibility. We needed to work on flexibility of the club because these are communities, again, that come and go. And Tuseme clubs demand extended hours of the day. So we had to look at how is that going to work in that kind of setting. Safeguarding referrals. Some refugee settings were more organized than others. So the communities knew where to go if they had a safeguarding issue, but that varied between the different refugee settings. Critical to integrate community support because these are the ones that will provide the sustainability beyond the life of this project. So institutional memory and sustainability mechanisms, they all work together right through to the end. What we found striking was that disability added an extra layer in terms of exclusion, and that needs to be addressed almost as a separate unit. Next, please. So with that, we have now learned and understood how the model works. We have understood the context in the refugee and IDP settings. So what now? So now we head for the deployment. We got an adopted model that we are deploying, beginning to deploy. Next stage will be going back into the field to collect data so that we can evaluate the impact of this new model. After that, we'll then have, we hope, we will have a toolkit that can be used in these refugee settings, and it will be quite comprehensive, but it can also be used in other countries. We will also by that point have a lot of disseminated research findings. Like I said, we already have 4 peer review papers and several in the under review. We have policy papers, we have stories that have been published on different platforms, and so on and so forth. Like I said, there'll be a QR code. What we do hope, though, like my colleague said, this is our 3rd and final year. The challenge for us is we have now introduced these folks in these communities to this fairly impactful model. We are a little worried that when it ends, which will be March 27, we risk leaving these people on a cliff edge. And so if anyone on this forum can share with us any additional sources of how we can extend this project, we would appreciate hearing from you. Thank you very much. I think that's about it, Ladana. We have got QR codes to our repository. You can go and find as much information of our disseminated products as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naomi and Dr. Sladana, for this presentation. One second. For our interpreter, I think you're in the wrong channel. You're in the English channel, so please switch. Sorry for that little hiccup, but I think this was a wonderful presentation about the Summit project, and I appreciate how creative it is in terms of combining with the drama and co-creation with students. Yes, and from our side as well, after each unit of webinars, we do a knowledge kit. So please also, we would love to include these resources from the project, the great findings, to share with all our participants and beyond. Next, please join me in welcoming Ms. Jasmine to tell us a little bit about her project about innovative education technology to strengthen foundational learning. Yes, Jasmine, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really happy to talk to you all today about our GPE KICS funded research, which we completed in Uganda, Chad, and Sudan. Our overarching research question for this program, which we did between 2020 and 2024, was what is needed to scale up education technology or EdTech programs in conflict-affected and low-resource settings. And so we took 5 angles on this question. We looked at the effectiveness of one of our EdTech programs called Can't Wait to Learn. We did costing research, we developed quality assurance tools, we examined the issues of attendance and retention, and we also looked at it with a policy lens. And in the final year of the project, we really dug into government adoption. So before I go into more detail on the highlights of our findings, let me tell you a bit about Can't Wait to Learn. Can't Wait to Learn was developed in 2012 and is a foundational reading and numeracy program. It is a digital learning program. The content is aligned to the curriculum in each of the countries that we implement in, and children move through this content in a self-paced manner. The narratives and the aesthetics of the games are co-designed with children and local artists in each of the countries of implementation. It's currently available in Arabic, English, French, and Ukrainian, and it's predominantly implemented on tablets, which are powered by solar panels, which we install, except for in Ukraine, which is the most recent iteration, and for that, it's available as an app. For effectiveness, we asked, what is the effect of Can't Wait to Learn on foundational learning outcomes when it's embedded in formal education in Uganda? And by that, I mean that it was replacing existing lessons rather than supplementary to schools and adding learning time. And we compared that to standard education. We did the evaluation with a cluster randomized control trial in 30 government schools in Isindra district of Uganda, which is a refugee hosting district. And we did it with P3 level, so similar to grade 3. We found that children doing Can't Wait to Learn outperformed their peers doing standard education on 6 out of 10 literacy outcomes and on all 7 numeracy outcomes. And that's what you can see here in these graphs. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go through all of these. Maybe just to highlight the largest effect that we saw was on phonics, where we saw more than 1 standard deviation of progress. For quality assurance, we started this research in Chad and then adapted it over to Uganda. We developed 2 tools. So the first one that you see on the left was a training tool measuring teachers' attitudes towards EdTech and their knowledge about Can't Wait to Learn. We used this before and after training initially. However, over time, we started using it as a monitoring tool to assess whether there were any knowledge gaps emerging or if there were any concerns around the use of technology in the classroom or in the learning centers, depending on the context. Then we developed an observation tool where the observer inputs on several aspects of implementation of Can't Wait to Learn, and then immediately receives a summary of this information. And that's what you can see on the right. And this was then used to inform a mentoring session, which directly follows the observation and delivers this targeted supervision towards teachers or learning facilitators. So these were 2 tools that we used together to improve the quality of implementation of Can't Wait to Learn. As I mentioned, we looked at government adoption, and this followed the randomized control trial, and we did this in Isindra district in Uganda. We followed a prototyping approach, which was these iterative cycles of implementation, learning, adaptation, and then re-implementing. And so this continuous learning process. And here we separate these into kind of different phases of adoption. So we saw that first phase of willingness to adopt Can't Wait to Learn was driven by alignment with national priorities. So, for example, on foundational literacy and numeracy, in the case of the Ugandan government, and also, I believe in 2021, the Ministry of Education put out a digital education agenda. Then, of course, also the evidence of effectiveness, and that came from the randomized control trial. Then we went into the adoption itself, and we had a 1-year transition period between War Child and the district local government in Isindra. And we worked really in partnership and essentially pulled apart the implementation model of Can't Wait to Learn, and then reassembled it in a way that it would fit within government structures and within existing school structures. This involved a large decentralization of responsibilities, where, for example, the supervision and mentorship and so on of teachers previously held by project officers shifted fundamentally to head teachers. And then, of course, this work continued beyond the KICS research. And so currently, Can't Wait to Learn is implemented now in 5 grades, P1 to P5, and in 36 schools within the district. And the district local government is very much in the lead of this implementation. Then, in parallel to all of this work, the Can't Wait to Learn team worked closely with the central government and the Ministry of Education to provide the necessary information and evidence and gather the necessary approvals from different technical working groups. So I think here what it really shows is the benefit of combining both a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach to institutionalizing an intervention. As I mentioned, we worked a lot on costing. The first 3 figures that you see there were value for money analyses done in different contexts. And the last one is a cost modeling approach. And as you can see, these are reducing gradually and then quite a substantial reduction to the current implementation under the district local government. So the drivers of these reduced costs came mainly from first integrating the implementation of the intervention into existing government and school roles. The second, of course, was a large expansion of the target group, where, for example, then a solar panel, or the cost of a solar panel, is then split between children from 5 grades as opposed to 1 grade. That had a substantial effect. And then also technological advancements. So the Can't Wait to Learn team has figured out how to essentially share fewer tablets between more children by having more flexible logins to the tablets. And also just overall, the cost of technology slowly reducing as technology becomes cheaper to produce and more widely available. For policy, we asked what are the enablers and barriers to adoption and scale up of education technology within these 3 conflict-affected countries. We did a policy network analysis, and here's some of just our cross-cutting findings. In terms of enablers, we found that the need to align with national priorities. As I mentioned the example of Uganda before, but also Sudan had recently established a digital education working group. Then was really the central role of the government. So it's fundamental to work with the government in order to scale up any program, I believe, as at least in these countries, it's the government who essentially is the duty bearer of provision of education to all of the children within the country, whether refugee, whether IDPs, or host community. It also highlighted the potential role of the private sector in relation to just a different mindset to scaling compared to NGOs and government, and different different funding avenues, and universities in the sense of knowledge generation, and also knowledge holders within each national context. In terms of needs, it was highlighted there was a need for strengthened IT capacity, technological capacity, both within the government, within the schools, and expanded and more reliable electricity and also internet connectivity. As I mentioned, we also took on this issue of attendance. So this had come out as this had come to light in previous research we conducted in Lebanon on Can't Wait to Learn, in which we saw students had, in learning centers, learners had an average of 40% attendance, so just 2 days out of the intended 5. 20% of children enrolled but never turned up, and then a further 20% dropped out over the course of 12 weeks. And of course, this will have negative effects on learning, but also on the cost efficiency of interventions. At the same time, we saw that caregivers were very interested and supportive of their children's education, but there was a gap between caregivers and the educators or learning centers. So in Uganda, across 4 refugee settlements, we took a participatory approach to intervention development, involving group model building, validation and stakeholder consultation, and prototyping. And we produced this program, this add-on program called School Links. It consists of 6 strategies. The first is meetings between caregivers and teachers, then translation at the meetings, then caregivers need to attend children's enrollment at school. There's attendance monitoring and reward, homework clubs, and safety to school, where children walk to school together in groups. Then we did a pilot study in Orochinga refugee settlement, still in Uganda, where we had 1 comparison school and 1 intervention school. And this was over 1 school term, so 10 weeks of implementation. And in this, we saw that students' school attendance and retention substantially increased. That's what you can see in the figures. We saw that caregivers had more positive attitudes towards school and education more broadly. There was an increase in caregivers' participation in school activities and a reduction in their barriers to participate, such as safety or language. There was an increase in encouragement towards children and in gaining education and more conducive home learning environments. And just to highlight something I find interesting is that in the retention figures, what you see in yellow in the comparison score is a slow reduction over time in retention, suggesting dropout over time. And we know that this happens throughout the school year. And in the intervention score, not only was that dropout stopped, but actually was reversed, and there was increased retention or increased enrollment and then retention at the end of term in this intervention period. But I will say this was just a pilot study and not a fully powered trial. So just some reflections. First, we conclude that Can't Wait to Learn is an effective education intervention to increase foundational literacy and numeracy in low resource settings, including conflict-affected settings. More broadly, we believe that it adds to the evidence base that digital personalized learning can substantially accelerate learning if there is the political will and the infrastructure in place. Also, that ongoing targeted teacher support can be more cost-effective than heavier and more time-consuming and more costly standalone trainings. Second, that School Links is a promising intervention to improve refugee school attendance and retention. Similarly to what previous speakers have both said, is that children's learning depends on the wider socio-ecological system, community, caregivers, teachers, school environment. These things are all fundamental and also not to be addressed in silos, but the relationship and the collaboration between these actors is really fundamental. Also, that despite this kind of shift in attention to learning, the issues of attendance and dropout remain unresolved, still warrant attention and still warrant investment. And lastly, and applying to both of these interventions, co-design with intended beneficiaries should be foundational to intervention design and not optional or a positive addition. And last of all, transitioning a program from NGOs to governments for institutionalization requires time, requires true collaboration, and requires, especially on the side of the NGOs, to let go of some aspects of implementation of the intervention as it has been designed in order for it to fit into the existing structures that are there. And of course, that innovations must align with national priorities. Of course, this was substantial teamwork. So these are the team members and also the different partners and collaborators and funders of this research. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that very comprehensive presentation about how the project, different parts of the project for it to succeed. And today we have talked a lot about teachers, the importance of teachers for refugee education. And lastly, our presenter, Philbert, will tell us how some innovative approaches to build teachers' capacity to strengthen education for refugees. Mr. Philbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues online. And this is Philbert Ida from Uganda with Finchurch Aid. And I'm pleased to share some of the lessons from my project that we have done in Uganda through the RTIA facility support. And basically, it's about teachers, but also good to point out here that unlike the other two that were about research projects, this is a project that's not necessarily a research project but with lots of learning embedded in it. And in terms of context, really for Uganda, in the next slide, you'll see already highlighted that Uganda hosts a huge number of refugees and asylum seekers. We started the project when it was around 1.6 million. Over a period of less than 2 years, we added additional 400,000 literally to over 2 million currently. And the settlement where we implemented this project is neighboring, so to say, Democratic Republic of Congo, where we have had influx of refugees almost on a regular basis. The peaks keep varying. But also important to note here that this influx really put strain on teachers and other educational resources that are there. When we started, we had about one teacher serving around 100 children or learners. And of course, along the way, it jumped as high as 200. But this just highlights the peaks of the influx that have been there. And of course, the stress that comes with that is one of the major issues. And teachers have not had real access to some of these recreational activities. And attrition rates have been very high among the teachers. And that's an indication of part of the stress. I think the presentation by Tuseme also earlier highlighted some of the psychosocial issues registered in Uganda. And so really high attrition rate. And in terms of teacher contracts, what I call stable contracts are usually contracts given by government, not by NGOs, which usually run for a few months. So this project was really designed, in the next slide, we'll see around 3 outcome areas. And the intention is really to find out how we can strengthen recruitment, onboarding, and retention procedures so that we do not only attract teachers, but also keep them and then find a way that it's easier to channel them into a more stable, long-term government recruitment process. But also, we intended to enhance career development and well-being options for teachers, really, given the context where there are many stresses that I just highlighted in the previous slide. And then lastly, it was also to look at the refugee teachers. We know that there are teachers that have come from their countries of origin, say Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, with qualifications for being a teacher. And when they come into Uganda, they are not usually immediately recognized as qualified teachers. So there's a process to that. And what we wanted to do is, how do we make this a systematic process of integrating them? So I would like to share a few of the approaches that we picked for particularly sharing here. One is around recruitment, onboarding, and retention of teachers. First, we are not only looking at addressing the turnover, but we also acknowledge this very high teacher turnover and shortage of teachers. Well, I just mentioned that we started when it was 100 learners per teacher. So what we did was to test our assumptions of harmonizing the recruitment process. We recruited 30 teachers in Uganda, but also just to point out here that this project runs in Ethiopia, where we recruited 18 teachers. And so we focused on harmonizing the recruitment process. Oftentimes you find in humanitarian settings that NGOs can have their own recruitment processes. But what we wanted here to do is to make sure that if there are any hiccups in the process within the local government procedures, that we harmonize. And of course, this do not only look at recruitment procedures, but the level of involvement and participation of the local government officials in this entire process, using their own procedures, own guidelines that have been harmonized. But also, beyond that, was around onboarding. We needed to align all this process with the local government. And of course, part of the conversation also was not just to recruit, that our projects are short-term, but we know that government does recruitments, and we would like to engage on the fact that these are teachers that you have interviewed, we have trained jointly, we know their capacities. We would like to prioritize these teachers in case of recruitment, or if you have other additional recruitments, channel these teachers in some of these schools. So that has been the nature of the conversations that we had. And then, of course, we also looked at building incentives for teachers. This is something that we did to create, to address really the financial stress that has been part of this. We started a saving and loan schemes. We had a seed capital, so to say, where schools started these saving and loan schemes. And the intention is really one, that most of these teachers in these schools are supported by the community or organization. So the financial incentives are that important, especially in the presence of shorter contract. We want to attract them, we want to retain these teachers, but also this is being done in the process of course, rewarding and recognizing best performing teachers. So we link the schools to local financial institutions. These are private sector players who offered to support setting up these schemes, including financial literacy. And the stage where we did the financial literacy is now evolving into engaging teachers into managing their own projects or businesses or investment. And I want to point out here that this, as we later see in the result, has been one of the key things whose impact has been way beyond the financial aspects. But also we looked at conducting gender barrier analysis. I think it has been mentioned already also in Tuseme's presentation around gender biases. We had very few female teachers. And so what we did was during recruitment, we had to recruit at least 70% of the teachers as being female. But this was not enough because we knew that from our analysis that teachers, for instance, who have babies or children below 2 years actually struggle to remain in schools or be on task for teaching. And so we did a gender barrier analysis, which informed the school improvement planning. And then beyond that, we also looked at the leadership positions, reflections around that. Why is it that it's only male teachers? That kind of conversation that are in the leadership. And so this made the school to do their own reflection on what they could change. And among the results we got, one is the fact that we did not only recruit about 70% of the teachers being female, but in terms of the turnover that we have just mentioned, that in the hardest hit areas, schools were 41%, that all the 30 teachers that we recruited remained during this period. But also we during our analysis realized that teachers who were part of the circle when they left actually engaged in the schools that are within the settlements. And so just to show the attraction that these circles have brought. But also important to know that the schools were more attractive to community paid teachers and teachers that are being paid by NGOs because that was a group that was literally moving away from the settlement, more towards government positions in other locations. So it worked in the favor of the schools in attracting, but also important to note here that among the schools that participated in this, I want to use the example of just one school where over 13 teachers went back to school for upgrading. Why do I bring this as an important point? Most of the teachers, female teachers that we were mentoring into leadership roles as part of this project, could not take on these roles simply because they did not have the adequate paper or qualification to be considered. You might have the experience, but not the qualification. So the conversation moved into how do we use these credit options to go back to school. So 13 teachers in this particular school went back, and of these 13 teachers, 6 were female teachers that have been part of the mentorship. So in a way, I would like to point out here that this had a ripple effect on some of the academic and qualifications that initially we thought it was a far-fetched process. So when we go to the second slide, around enhancing career development and professional well-being. Here, we did a number of trainings, and one of the key things was contextualizing these modules. A number of them were contextualized already for Uganda, which we used, but key among them is the teachers in crisis context. But also in this delivery, connection with the tutors from the nearby colleges was very critical. Why this was a choice was the fact that these tutors do support these schools as part of the sustainable support that government offers to these schools. So it was important that they're involved in this, but also the teacher training colleges do not have fully updated curriculum for teacher training that include these EIE modules. So this was a way of transferring this knowledge to these colleges, well, because we know changing the curriculum for teacher training colleges can take a process. So that was one of the key things. They provided support supervision, and we did training on TSCC, and then multi-language classroom management. This was where I think a much bigger appreciation from teachers about this particular module, because we looked at addressing not only the language barriers, where we engaged some of the refugee teachers themselves, but also we looked at targeted instructions as part of this, because we know that literacy and numeracy levels are at different levels. So the targeted instruction or teaching at right level in a number of cases, as normally called, came in handy. And we looked at the green skills and digital skills. And after these trainings, much as the CCTs were supporting, the peer support models, mainly through the teacher learning circles, was really, really critical. I think one of the presenters talked about institutional memories of the training. With a high teacher turnover, it's vital that you make these peer support models very, very strong and very active. And so this was a way for the teachers to support themselves, but also to use the knowledge that has been passed on them. So this was so key in the sense that when we did our ongoing assessment, the preliminary findings indicate that about 80% of the teachers actually improved significantly around the methodology, around teaching. And also key considerations around the modules of teachers in crisis context and the competencies that are associated with them came in handy. And given the context, this was a big improvement, because we started at the baseline level where most of the schools were below 40%. And then one of the appreciated trainings, like I mentioned, was multilingual classroom management, because this was one aspect that was missed in a number of trainings that have been done by different actors in the past. But also, critically, teachers that reported professional satisfaction, but also stress related to financial other issues reducing. Because at the time we started at 69%. These were teachers that were saying, okay, this is unbearable. This was unbearable. But to get teachers that not only include professional, but also other financial stress-related satisfaction to this level was one of the key highlights. And I think once we get the assessments that are ongoing, we should be able to quantify some of the dimensions of this satisfaction, because we realize some were not only looking at investments that we're able to do, but they're looking at them being able to support their children to go to school and then going back to school by themselves as well to upgrade. So quite a number of options that in terms of the attributes that we will be looking at. And then in the next slide, which is our last outcome area, we were looking at recognition and integration of refugee teachers. And really we wanted to keep this simple in terms of raising the voices of the teachers themselves. And we had peer-to-peer teacher networks to amplify these teacher voices. And key in the voices that came actually were the voices of the refugee teachers. And this conversation was done in such a way that the conversation started with the community, because the community indicated we have so many teachers. Some of them are refugees, but have qualified in Uganda. They know how to teach the Ugandan curriculum. While others came with their papers, they qualified already. So the conversation shifted to how do we map out these individuals, map out not only their voices, but also their documents, and we support the equating of these documents to equivalent. And this actually led to documentation in the first 3 months of 29 teachers whose documents were equated. And of course, after equating, you are not necessarily recognized as a qualified teacher. It just acknowledges some of the competencies that you do have. So one of the conversations that became critical was also, how do we ensure that refugee teachers are not invisible to the system? If there's a teacher management information system, how do we ensure that teachers or refugees actually become visible in the system so that we know exactly how to plan, how to also utilize their resources in the settlement? So out of these 29 documents, actually by the time that we did a midterm assessment, 14 teachers that we were tracing had actually their information in the teacher management information system. And the whole idea is to ensure that visibility. And of course, these conversations eventually moved into the local government in terms of how do we engage refugee teachers in our teacher support, the continuous professional development that we do. And I would like to move away from this point just to highlight that in terms of the lessons learned is that professional recruitment at a project level like this can catalyze this national conversation, and the local governments that are at the forefront are really key. And holistic support drives much of this retention, especially when it goes beyond the professional skills only, but to some of the personal well-being aspects. And of course, practical solutions for gender barrier that needs to enter into the school improvement plan is really key, and the mentorship level. But as we move to the last slide, I just want to highlight the fact that the visibility of refugee teachers in national information systems is really key. And that's something that I want to emphasize, that it's a key in their support, but also recognition. But also integrating these modules that are crisis context related into pre-service teacher education curriculum is something that needs to be intentional about. It reduces the cost of training, but also it makes the system ready to receive new arrivals. And of course, policy discussions on teacher well-being needs to progress beyond the recognition and rewards, and move into integrated support services where even private sector could be involved in that solution. And lastly, gender lens in the school improvement planning is key, and this needs to be part of the framework for approval of these school improvement plans. And I think that's what I could share, but we look forward to the final assessments, and then we'll be able to share with the team for learning as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Filbert. And thank you to all our presenters for today's webinar. It was really, really rich. And I've seen that our audience has been very active as well. So please allow me to hand over to my colleague, Marianne, to lead the Q&A session.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Camelia, for the handover, and thank you to the wonderful speakers. It was such an impassioned and such an informative discussion so far. We've had a lot of good questions in the chat box. I think what I'd like to do, if we have the time, I'd like to pose one question. It's sort of a combined question to each of the three case study speakers who have gone. That would be Dr. Naomi, Jasmine, and Mr. Philibert. And then I would like to ask one question that all three of you might like to address at the end that's sort of overlapping. So we'll go first to Falway, Dr. Naomi. There were a couple of questions about your work. So one question is that how have you explored how TUSIME might want to integrate with the government and your sustainability question? So are you exploring integration with the government? And another question, how can we access more information about your specific activities? Is there a link or a web page or a document that you could share? So Dr. Naomi, those are your questions. Over to you first.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Have we explored adapting to TUSIME in government? The answer is yes. We started with Uganda, where we had a meeting with the chairperson of the National Curriculum Development Council, and also because Uganda is in the process well, it's not in the process of introducing, it is in early stages of introducing competence-based learning. So we discussed with the chairperson of the National Curriculum Development Council, and he was very, very receptive and actually gave us pointers to how we should talk to the commissioner in charge of secondary education or high school education, so that perhaps we can discuss how this can be incorporated as an after-school activity. But he was sufficiently impressed to think it should actually be assessed. It should be included as one of the competence skills. So yes, we have, but and I think that there has been some communication in Kenya. I don't know if my colleague Rose is still on the call or not. She could speak to that. But what we need is more of that kind of access to government, because we see them as key partners. Is our information accessible 100%? We will bring back the QR codes so you can click on and you'll find the full report. Each report is about 200 pages, so it wouldn't have made sense bringing it here, but it's accessible.
Yes, Naomi, sorry to interrupt, but just to say I've also now put a link in a chat, just
wonderful.
so that you with all the publications, and it's an ongoing thing. We keep adding to it, so keep an eye on it.
Thank you, Sladan. Is that okay? Have we addressed the two questions?
Yes, I believe so, Dr. Naomi. And don't go away, because we might have a chance at the very end, when I ask the others some questions, to come back to Falway's perspective. So thank you, Dr. Naomi, for that. The next question or group of questions I'd like to address to Jasmine from War Child Alliance. So Jasmine, there were some questions about children, girls with disabilities who are refugees or IDPs. I'm wondering if you'd like to take those questions. Could you explain how you identified learners with disabilities, what types of disabilities you focused on? And the second question, what more can be done to support refugee or displaced girls with disabilities?
Great. Thank you, Marianne, and others for these questions. In terms of disabilities, I'm assuming the question is about the school links intervention, where I showed the effects on attendance and retention for disability. So for those, we identify children just using the Washington Group Short Survey. So this is a screener tool. It was non-in-depth assessment. I saw the question of whether it included learning disabilities. It includes some cognitive disabilities, so the capacity of around memory and concentration, but it is a screener tool. And we collected that as part of our demographic information, and that was how we disaggregated our findings for children with disabilities. But we did not do in-depth analyses into that group. However, in the qualitative data, what was mentioned in relation to disability was that there were two things about school links that particularly supported children with disabilities. One was that in the safety to school strategy, where children moved to school together in groups, children with disabilities were helped by their peers. And this wasn't an active, let's say, instruction as part of the intervention. It was actually something that happened very organically. So, for example, children would go within their group to a child's house where the child is in a wheelchair and push that child to school in the wheelchair. Another one was also the homework groups, which are done at the weekends and supervised by volunteer caregivers. One of the children with disabilities said that within the classroom, as my colleague from Finchurch Aid mentioned, that these classes are often huge numbers of children. So it's quite a loud and noisy place. And this particular child had a hearing impairment, so cannot always hear what's being instructed, and would sometimes be afraid to ask the teacher for more information. Whereas in these small homework learning groups, which were up to 10 maximum children, they were more comfortable, they were more able to talk directly with peers in a quieter environment, and that helped them to do their homework. And I think, as we know, there's an association between completing homework and also between learning, and how that influences attendance. And it can create either a vicious cycle or a positive cycle. And essentially, that particular child felt more confident in going to school, and that's just one example of how attendance was influenced. The other question, I believe, was around what can be done more for children with disabilities in refugee learning, and that is not I'll be very honest, that's not my area of expertise. I think it's a combination. I mean, I've worked as a special needs teaching assistant in mainstream schools. I think it depends very much on the disability in question. I think that there's a huge benefit for children with disabilities being catered to through reasonable adaptations in classroom environments to still include them within classrooms. However, like I've said, you have to recognize the challenge of that in refugee settings where teachers are already very few and very high workloads. You also have very homogeneous classes in terms of age, in terms of there's also trauma, of course, as well. And I can imagine the challenge of teachers to be able to adequately include children with disabilities. But I think that's as far as I can comment on it at the moment. I hope that's okay.
Right. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you. And we definitely want to include those questions because they came up for quite a few different speakers as you were speaking. What can be done for refugee children with disabilities? It came up time and time again, hence my question. If others would like to come in on this point from our speaking panel, feel free to come in on this, perhaps as I address a question to you. I know time is going, so I'd like to shift to Mr. Filbert, and then we'll go back to Dr. Naomi and others in just a moment. So Mr. Filbert, we have a couple of questions for you. You spoke a lot about teachers, and that really resonated with our attendees, many of whom are teachers themselves, because this is an Africa Teacher webinar series, and they work with teachers or else they are teachers. So allow me to ask a few questions. So one question is that, do you think that teachers should focus more on skill training or more on the academic degree programs when they're teaching students? So the question about skills, teaching practical skills, maybe TVET education versus traditional content-based or academic education. What should teachers focus on when they're teaching refugee and displaced children? That's one question for you, Mr. Filbert. Another question is that how your team identified teachers for recruitment. How did they motivate these teachers? Did they provide them certificates, awards, or other types of ways to motivate them and to sustain the teacher program? So, Mr. Filbert, a few questions for you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I'll go through them. Starting with the first one on the practical or vocational skills versus academic trainings. Personally, I think we do not have to make it either or, because we are looking at designing an education system that does not have a dead end, first of all, where children can move in a different paths without being hindered. I would like to use an example of this particular group of teachers that are supporting overaged learners for their class and accelerated education program. So what we'll do was to give them what you call academic, basic literacy and numeracy. But even as we do this, we have mapped out transition pathways, because some of them are, child mothers, child fathers that have families that are dependent on them. So what we'll do is, once they meet the qualifications or requirements, they eventually transition to vocational skilling. But in Uganda, vocational skilling, which is non-formal, is not a dead end, because even on that path, you get back to formal education. So I would like to say that it's not either or. It should be opportunities for all, because the needs will be different. And then this is particularly critical in the displacement context, that we give these opportunities for the learners. And then secondly, around how do we identify teachers? How do we motivate? How do we provide certificates? Well, identifying teachers for recruitment, we use, like, as I mentioned, harmonizing this process with the way government does. Government usually puts out adverts. And these adverts, what we do is make sure that it reaches, for instance, even the refugee communities. We share it extensively. And so that with this exposure, the refugees do come and apply, and other teachers do apply. What is critical in the refugee context or any crisis context is that the attraction of refugees or other host community into the settlements where these refugees can be a huge factor for retention as well. That's why you want to expose this to as many people as possible, and then eventually they express interest. But during recruitment, you should be taking interest in, for instance, how do I make sure that there's a greater inclusion in terms of, say, refugee teachers that might be there, female teachers that might be there. And of course, after this recruitment process, the trainings do bring in certificates. But we want to look at motivation in a broader way, not just the certificate. We look at recognition and reward for teachers in a diverse way, and we do this with the local government. And the climax is usually during the World Teachers Day, where we recognize them, but also parents have taken this on, recognizing and rewarding teachers. So it has to be something that is broader than just motivation in a few aspects. But of course, MHPSS has been one of those motivating factors for the teachers, which has been part of this project. And it has really increased their engagement in a number of school activities. Thank you. Over.
Right, Mr. Filbert, thank you so much for the really informed answer on that. That was really great. I know the time is ticking, but I would just like to pose one question to all three of our wonderful speakers, Jasmine, Filbert, Naomi, to see if any of you would like to address this question from your own project's perspective. So there have been a few comments in the chat box wondering, should refugee and displaced children be integrated into national education systems, so-called mainstream schools and classrooms, or taught through separate programs? So I think the question there is a nuanced one that could be addressed maybe from your own evidence. Would anyone like to take that question?
I can have a go, and then Sladana, feel free to chip in. Should refugee and displaced children be integrated in mainstream school? So there is already some work going on that FAO is doing in terms of integration across. But we have spoken at length about teachers needing extra training. So there has to be a lot of investment in training the teachers to prepare them to have these children integrated. On my personal belief and experience, I think that is would be a very welcome gesture, because what we want are children from refugee and displaced areas to not remain marginalized. We want to have them prepared to live as normal a life as everyone else. So if there are any opportunities to have the two communities integrated and taught and educated together, that would be the ideal, so that the stigma of one being refugee and one being however you want to describe them, because you are in your home today, tomorrow you're a refugee, so you don't know. So I think integration would be very welcome, but there has to be recognition of the impact on resources of the school that hasn't been prepared to host the refugee children. Thank you.
Maybe just I can add to what Dr. Naomi has indicated, that I'll definitely think integration is a better option. In Uganda, the integration has happened in the sense that they are part of the National Development Plan. They are part of the Educational Management Information System that informs planning. And also, this is really part of the conversation around humanitarian development nexus, that this particular settlement where we have been in Uganda implementing this project was established in 1960s. And so what has happened is the fact that we have had refugees that could not go back. And so if they cannot go back to their country, do you leave them at the mercy of, being educated, and then they can't access any opportunities? So integration gives them that opportunity to partake of the advantages and opportunities that are there in Uganda, but also acknowledge that we need as countries to prepare for them to be integrated. The visibility of the learners and the refugee teachers is very key, but also schools need to be supported around language bridging, for instance. That's a very key thing. But also recognition of prior learning, for instance, for refugees that come without their documents, the system needs to recognize that prior learning, and then they should be placed at the right level. So integration, for me, will be a key thing. Thank you.
Maybe just to add briefly, I really agree with both of my fellow panelists, but also I would just say I think it's difficult to classify refugees as a single entity. For example, I think it's more important to kind of to try and consider as much as possible the individual needs of individual children. And I think that that's also what I was trying to say in regards to disability. But as with the example of Uganda, in the Southwest, for example, there are refugees who have been living there since the 80s. That's a very, very different population to those in the North, in West Nile, displaced from South Sudan much, much more recently. So indeed, issues of language barriers that might be applicable to some, and it might be less applicable to others. Also, depending on the amount of time specific children have been out of school, will have a huge effect on how on that integration into mainstream school. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Philbert, for that response. Definitely a nuanced one about how long refugees have been in a country, how to classify them, where they would best find their access and their quality that they need at this time in their lives. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I said I would just ask that last question, but there are so many good questions coming in, and now some of them are coming in too. So if I could maybe pose one last question to the three of you, but then ask you to respond perhaps in the chat box, and also look to see at some other incoming questions in the chat box, because we don't have time to hear the answers, but we'll have to go to our closing speaker. But I would like to at least pose the question to you. So someone before asked, what bold changes in refugee access to education, training for teachers, and support do you believe would truly transform education for refugee and displaced children and the teachers who are in that situation themselves or are teaching these children. So what bold change or changes would you recommend as your closing answer? If you wouldn't mind answering in the chat box if you'd like, but I'll turn it back over to my colleague Camelia for the last part of the segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and I think that's also a very creative way to do our Q&A, as there are so many great questions from our speakers, from our participants. Last but not the least, please join me in welcoming Sarah Boguzi to share her final reflections. I know that all of us have got a lot of inspiring thoughts, innovative approaches from this session. And now we would like to welcome Sarah to share hers. Sarah? Great. Sarah, are you? And in the meantime, we're going to share a link for our survey. If you have any suggestions for this webinar session, we would love to hear from you. What are the interested topics? What are your inputs? Yes, I just dropped the survey link in the chat. And Sarah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Camila. So I'd already thanked everyone for joining in on this 13th webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, right from the beginning, this has been a very rich encounter for all of us to learn more about education of the refugees and the vulnerable groups of learners in our midst. Quite very good papers have been presented. And what I would say is that I liked so much about the statistics in those papers. And that shows that as we still continue to have the conflicts and the displacements, the disasters due to climate change, we shall continue to have refugees in our midst. But what came out clearly was that all of us are putting a lot of effort on education of these vulnerable children. And Maria said somewhere, she talked something about education is a life-saving and a transformative intervention. Indeed, you're very, very right, because as these children keep moving from one country to the other, from one place to the other, because in the presentations, we also told there are those that are displaced within their own countries. So as they keep being displaced, we need to think ahead about their education. And we're always saying education cannot wait. So as we think about education, there is a lot to do with the teachers. We've mentioned the roles of the teachers, how we can create a safe environment for children to learn, how we can do capacity building for the teachers, and a lot really. And by doing so, we are making sure that no one is left behind. In the last questions that we've had, questions and answers from Mariana, there have been quite a number of insights. And one thing I take note in there is that as we continue doing these interventions and all the work that we are doing, we should work with the governments of those very different countries. There is no way we can do all this that we are doing without considering the policy guidelines, the policy provisions, because at one time, we may not be there, but the governments of the place should be able to take forward what is happening. Accessibility to the materials, the QR codes, yes, these are helping a lot. And I would just encourage all of us to keep using them, because in there we shall be able to pick a lot of information and and use. There is a second question she asked, and somebody said they're from Watch Out, Canada. She mentioned that, yes, she tried to talk about the support in schools for learners with disabilities, but at some point she said she's not very good in this area. Maybe they will have to add something very small. Myself, like you've seen in what has been displayed here, I'm a commissioner for special needs in Ministry of Education and Sports in Uganda. And really my area is about learners with disabilities. We have a USEP project that is funded by the World Bank. And in here, we're also supporting refugees and the vulnerable groups. But now for us, our main interest has been learners with disabilities. And this, we have provided quite a number of innovative approaches so that we are more specific to learners with disabilities. We have provided assistive devices like the Braille machines. We have provided like the laptops, the Fusion. Mentioned there are quite a number. So these are different forms of approaches the learners can use to support them in their learning. Because if I'm not able to read print, what else can I use so that for me I'm also able to read like the rest of the learners? So this is what we are doing, and we are working with our partner window. We have provided quite a number of assistive devices. We've also trained teachers, because without training teachers, it also becomes very difficult for them to support these learners. And the kind of training we are doing is the specialized pedagogy, not the general training. I liked very much what Philbert talked about when he was asked about what do you go, is it the academic or it is the skills? Indeed, Philbert, I want to concur with you that both are required. We have seen very many different countries. I know Uganda, we are not yet there, but we've seen very many countries having different pathways. If you cannot take this pathway, then there is an alternative pathway for you to take on. Philbert, thank you so much for that. And I would also encourage all of us that in our different countries, as we are looking at the competence-based curriculum, let us develop the different pathways, because these will enable our learners have different pathways of transition. If we don't do that, then we shall be doing them a disservice. And final, about the refugees being integrated, I think this is also very good. We should see these refugees integrated in the mainstream, because the curriculum we are undertaking is the same. Because when I see them, the ones we have with in Uganda, they are taking on our curriculum, but maybe the only difference is that the language, because some of them come with Arabic, others come with French, and those different ones. But at the end of the day, all of us are doing the same thing, and we're in the same thing. I know I'm beyond time. I want to thank everyone, and especially Kix, Ikba, for organizing these frequent webinars. I know all of us who are here, because I see the number is so big, all of us must appreciate that there is a lot we are learning from these webinars, and I only pray that we continue with them. And with those few words, this meeting is closed. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Actually, it's thanks to you all our speakers and our participants to have this conversation here that makes this platform really rich in content and in thoughts. Thank you. And I have shared some links in the chat regarding resources to our knowledge platform. And for the recordings and PowerPoints, they will be shared early next week after this meeting is concluded. And our next webinar for the series is going to be on July 16th with the topic on improving educational opportunities for disadvantaged girls. And the third one is on August 20th. So as some of you know, for people who have attended the full 3 sessions for 1 unit will receive a certificate of participation. So I hope you have learned a lot from this session, and we look forward to see you again on July 16th. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, everyone.